Lost in the woods. I'm lost in the woods. No one's going to find me. This is how I die. I feel like I'm going to cry. Lost in the woods. I'm lost in the woods. And welcome back to Devlog. In the last part, I worked on the accessibility options for my game, and in this part, I work on the underwater physics mechanics and movement mechanics in my game. The first thing I did is work on the top surface of water physics areas, this being the actual surface of water areas in Pep-Pel. One of the things I wanted to update with this is making it so I actually had a physics-based water shader that would react and ripple in time with Pep-Pel's movement in the water, and I didn't know how to do that because I don't know much about shader graphs, and I could not find a single tutorial on how to do such a thing, so I made a different version instead. And I actually like this a bit more because the version I made using sprite layering I think matches the art style of Pep-Pel a little bit more, and there is one feature of this which I think is improved upon than the shader idea that I had originally wanted to go with. The surface of water, being the different overlaid sprites, has different overlaid sprites that tile to make the effect of waves moving up and down for the water surface. These have one tile in front for the front of the wave, one tile behind to give depth to the water, and then multiple tiles that are arranged at a 90-degree angle that can only be seen for certain camera angles for the surface of the water, and then foam on top of the water. This gives the water surface a nice almost 3D effect to it, and means that you can see when underneath the water above where the surface is based on where this 3-dimensional 90-degree sprite is, or when falling down into the water it has more of a 3-dimensional view to the surface of the water. I think this effect looks pretty nice. I think it looks stylized enough to fit with Pep-Pel, and I think it suits the other sprites a lot more than perhaps a more physics-based color water with a shader ripple effect may suit the game. The next thing I did was add the option for the player to use potions underwater. The reason this was not already added is because originally the usage of underwater physics was added before I had even planned or coded in the functionality of potions into Pep-Pel, but now that I have potions and it's 9 months later, I can add potions to the underwater physics system. This is pretty simple. I just enable the substate of attacking to work underwater, I add logic for how this will work underwater, and then I throw the potions as normal. One difference to this is that when potions are underwater, they will have less gravity applied to them, and their gravity amount will be lessened because they are underwater. And ordinarily it would be 12, underwater it is 3. So potions work differently underwater than they do on the surface, which plays into how the underwater physics in Pep-Pel actually works, because the dash, as you remember from the previous devlog about water, also works completely differently underwater than it does on the surface of the water, also known as dry land. Because of this change, dashing and potion throwing when underwater actually works a whole lot faster, which I really like. Underwater physics in games I feel people generally do not enjoy, because the default way to engage with underwater mechanics in video games is to make your character incredibly sluggish and slow. So to counteract that, underwater Pep-Pel just moves very quickly, so it's probably going to be more fun for players. The next thing I did was update the water surfaces and the complexity for the player to move in complex water surfaces. For example, if the player was swimming in a cave, they would swim down, and then maybe there would be air pockets underneath the depth of the water where the player could come up for air. This in the previous system would not have worked because the actual physics for the water is just calculated on knowing where the water surface level point is, and then having this as a reference, and if the player exceeds this amount they surface from the water. I have now changed it so the player can detect the surface of the water in multiple different points. This is very simple. I did not change much, I just changed the ability for the player to detect multiple waters that they would be transferring over to. So the water that may be at a different level where there is air pockets underneath the regular amount of water is just a second block of water that the player is surfacing into. They're changing their logic to depend on this water surface, and then they can surface through this water surface because it is just lower down in the levels of water. Basically, instead of water surfaces being one giant object, there are multiple different blocks that can have different surfaces to the water that the player can interact with. This can make swimming in water more dynamic and better for the player. I originally did not add this because my level design for the water was going to be primarily having a lot of levels be completely submerged in water, but now I've designed the levels for the water levels, and a lot of them have some maneuverability that requires the player to be able to access air pockets or enter and leave complex water surfaces and different water levels, and have water levels for the water rise or fall. So because of this, I had to make the water mechanics a lot more complex in player detection of these. Were I a dev, I would log every day of my life. The next thing I added was the logic for poison water. I needed poison water because I needed a system that would let me design levels where the player has to go up for air. In the original water design in Pep-Pel, I thought having the player have to go up for air or exit the water periodically when underwater would not be indicative to fun water levels, and I was correct. But in designing the aquatic abode level, which is the water level, I designed some aspects of the level where the player may have to go up and get air or exit the water periodically and make tight movements when underwater to be able to navigate the surface with enough time to not die horrifically by drowning. So because of this, I have to make two water types, this being the regular water and the poisoned water, which is a pinky purple variant of the water, and also tar, but I'll talk about that later. And then these can work differently for the player. They are very visually different on account of the colours. And then we run a function for drowning the player when they are underwater in the poison water for too long. This is very simple. When the player enters or exits water, they will detect if the water was or was not poison. If the water was poison, we will run a IE numerator, which is actually the first time I have ever used that function in Pep-Pel, which may say something about my coding skills. All this does is count down from 7 to 0 and then drowns a player. Why is it an arbitrary number, you may ask, and not 5? Because 7 was the most satisfying number I could think of. I use an IE numerator for this function in opposed to a regular timer with the movement scripting, because with this I can take periodic blocks when counting down to murder the player, and I can make a visual for the player's countdown. So 3 seconds pass, the timer will tell the player that they have 3 seconds left before they drown. Then 1.25 seconds pass, the timer will tell the player they have 2 seconds before they drown, then 1.5 seconds pass, the player will be told they have 1 second before they drown, and then 1.75 seconds will pass, and then the player drowns. You may be thinking that those numbers don't add up correctly, and when you tell the player that they have 3 seconds left to drown, they actually have somewhere along the lines of 4 seconds before they drown. The reason for this is that I like lying to the player, and I also felt like it is more satisfying if the player believes they have a shorter time in the water before they die. If I actually tell the player 3 seconds before they drown they are going to drown, they won't have enough reaction time and they will most likely die. But if I extend this amount and I lie to the player when they have 3 seconds left to drown, they will see that they are going to drown soon, they will know this, and then they will exit the water more readily, while completely lying to the player that they actually have more time than they do. This means it's going to be way more satisfying when the player narrowly avoids drowning in the water when they have 1 second left, because they actually have somewhere closer to 2 seconds left before they drown. But they won't know this, because they're not looking at the timer on the top left of the screen. Basically, it's just lying to the player about a timer, where the timer will tick slower the closer the player is to drowning, because it's more satisfying if the player narrowly avoids death. Then when the timer ticks to 0, I murder the player. This is very simple. I run the player dev script and that works as it normally would work. The only difficulty in this system is when the player enters or exits the water, I have to detect if the water is poisoned. This is very simple because the water already has its value of what the water is being sent to the player so they can correctly swim in the water and find the exit of the water. So all I have to do is add a bool for this if the water is poison, and then if the player exits water that is poison, all I do is I remove the water poison timer from functioning so the player isn't killed by drowning when they have exited the water or entered into a different water that is less hazardous. The next water type we have is tar. I needed a water type that would kill the player instantly upon entering into the water. So I made one water type that is tar. It's black, it's sticky, and if you fall in it, you die horrifically. Tar. The actual functionality for this is very simple. We have a different visual for the tar. It's black, very clearly readable as tar. We have a dampening amount made to the player's movements when they are in the tar. This is the same for every single water surface, but it's the same for poison and regular water, so it's not really viewed when inside of those. When in tar, this is dampened to the point where the player can barely even move in the tar, so they won't be able to enter or exit it, unless they have very, very tight movement where they very carefully enter and then exit the tar very quickly before the timer runs down. And then I have a modifier to the player's drowning timer when in the tar, so it moves incredibly quickly. The 3 seconds is more like 0.3 seconds. So the player drowns very, very quickly in tar. This is really simple. I just need the hazard that would be water surfacing, because if I have the water level where all the hazardous spikes in water, it may not look very interesting when I want to have certain areas where maybe there's a water surface you have to bounce along with the water bubbles, but if you fall in it, it's just immediately spikes. It kind of doesn't read very well for a design perspective that the water would be hazardous, so I would want another water surface that could be used as a very immediate hazard. Finally, we have water bubbles. These are very self-explanatory. They are bubbly surfaces that appear on the top of water. They work exactly the same as every other bouncy surface, except for when used, they have a cooldown timer for when they will be used again. This is very simply achieved. When bounced on, they have a 5-second cooldown timer before they appear again. This is more needed in water surfaces such as tar, where you would bounce on the bubble, and then if you miss your jump from that, you will fall into the tar after you bounced on it and die. The idea being that there needs to be some kind of risk on top of a water for a bounceable object, so these have a delayed timer to them, because if not, the player doesn't really have much of a hazard for them because they are very big objects. The player's not going to miss these, mostly, when jumping onto them, so the player has to have another hazard, that being the fact that these are a one-time use with a cooldown timer, and then once the cooldown timer has ticked, they will come back. This is very easily achieved. I just have an animation stretch to the length of whatever the cooldown timer is, of the bubble reappearing, and then it blends into its regular idle animation. And then I just have a bool for if the bubble can be used or if this is inactive. If the bool is true, the player can bounce on it and then the bool is set to false, the timer ticks down, the bool is then set to true again, and the bubble can be used once again. The actual visual for this was very fun to draw. It's just a bubble with different reflective surfacing colours on it, so it's a very basic bubble with some bright, nice colours on it that I think look quite pretty. I do so enjoy drawing bubbles for Pep-Pel. This and the costume bubble were very fun to draw. They're incredibly easy to draw. I just draw a circle, add transparency to it, add an overlay of random colours to give the reflection of a bubble, and then increase the saturation of this very extremely. Devlog over. The next part will hopefully be about the demo being finished or the hub area being more concretely fleshed out in design, or maybe it will be about the new level that I am making. Who's to say? You'll have to subscribe to find out, won't you?